Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of I'll Call You Right Back podcast with me, your host. My name is Chad Medved. This is my podcast. Appreciate yinz being here as usual. First and foremost, we had a hell of a last week. Last week, I had a sold-out Berg Bus event taking a whole group of people to Castle Blood in Monessen, PA. Castle Blood, local haunted house, been around for over 3 decades. I've interviewed the owner, Rick Dick, on this podcast multiple times, 2 times before, but over the last couple weeks I took 2 shuttles to 2 different local haunted houses, the first one being 100 Acres Manor over in South Park, and then on Friday I took a bus full of people to Castle Blood to experience in my opinion, the most unique haunted house in Pittsburgh, Castle Blood. Absolutely fantastic time. We had a whole variety of people that came on the bus. You know, I had some loved ones, my mother was on there, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, but then, besides that, it was all different people that I've never met before. And that was a really, really cool feeling to pull up down there in the waterfront, see the Berg Bus pull up, and then see all these different people that I've never met before come and, have fun on an event that I curated. I will be curating more events in the future, some movie screenings, some different other events with the Berg Bus, but very excited for, everything that's coming up. In addition to the events that I'm planning, I just wanted to put a call to action to anyone that's watching or listening to this right now to, it's October, it's Halloween time, spooky season. Please take a second and patronize your local haunted houses if you can. They are doing, they're doing God's work at local haunts around here. The majority of, the local haunt business is, it's a thankless job. There's not a crazy amount of money in working in haunted houses. So, a lot of places like Castle Blood strictly rely on volunteers, and, 3 decades of business is, that stands the test of time, and that speaks volumes to have a group of people to be able to make this haunted house happen every year. And our trip to Castle Blood on Friday could not have went better, and I cannot thank Rick and his whole crew over there enough. And I just wanted to say again, please, if you guys have not heard of Castle Blood, or you have not been to Castle Blood and you guys are Halloween people, I cannot recommend it enough. A little hop, skip, and a jump over to Monessen. You can get tickets online. You could get your time slots online. Simple as that. If you don't want to wait in line, go buy a ticket online. You pull right up to the castle. You could go right through and, try to make it out alive. But the events I'm excited about. But what else am I excited about? I am excited to have a great friend back in I'll Call You Right Back studios this week. This week, I sit down with none other than John Schalcosky, the man behind Odd Pittsburgh. Now, if you are familiar with Odd Pittsburgh is a local historian who his sole purpose in life is to document and prove and uncover the weird and mysterious history that Pittsburgh has to offer. A fantastic person, John Schalcosky is, and he is doing all sorts of incredible things for the city of Pittsburgh and documenting the incredible history that, has built the city that we all love. Some of it good, some of it bad. Previously, we've had episodes. I think one was, 213 was an episode. Then we had another one that was like 220 maybe. But John is a mind-blowing person that has a crazy brain that can store information and access information way quicker than most human beings. The guy's an encyclopedia, especially about the city of Pittsburgh. But in addition to, all the stuff that he talks about in everyday life, we have put together some live events at Bottle Rocket you guys might have been to. We had 3 Bottle Rocket events up there. Basically what we do is we create a PowerPoint and we give a a PowerPoint presentation about cool shit about the city of Pittsburgh. You know, you get to go and experience a school project basically, but the only difference between this is we actually care about what we're doing, and we're holding it at one of the coolest venues in town in Bottle Rocket. But yeah, we've done that in the past. They've been great times. We've had multiple episodes, but you know, during the October season, I like to lean into the Halloween topics, and John has an endless list of spooky stories. So, you know, a little bit of backstory about John. He's kind of been out of commission the last, year, basically. He has been going through some very serious health problems, and he is finally seeming to be on the mend. Whenever we recorded this conversation, he was recovering from surgery. So as you listen to this, a week and a half beforehand, he had a pretty major surgery, and this guy is just in the studio rattling off stories that none of us have never heard about, and it's pretty incredible. John is an incredible human being. I love him so much. I am so fortunate to have, met him through this podcast that I've created, and I've been so lucky to be able to sit down and have these incredible conversations that are, documenting some of the wildest things that you will ever hear about Pittsburgh, things that you don't know. I could guarantee you that. So once you are done listening to part one of this episode, because you already know, once he came into the studio, I knew we were going to be talking for hours. So obviously this is a 2-part episode. We had a over 3 hour long conversation, but once you listen to this part, if you guys are still inclined to dig a little bit deeper, John and I have, I think, 4 more episodes. I think both previous podcast episodes we've talked have been 2-parters. So there's 4 more episodes that you can listen to. And let me tell you, they are all insane. A benefit to all this, now that I'll Call You Right Back is on video, for anyone that's listening, you guys are obviously listening and you can't really see what we're doing, but if you want to see some of the visual aids that John brought with him to talk about during our conversation, hop over to my YouTube channel, go on YouTube, hit up I'll Call You Right Back. You could find it on there, and there's a full video episode to go along with part 1 of our conversation this week. So I will let yinz all listen to it. I am very excited about it. And I just appreciate it. Every week that you guys are here, I just appreciate it, and I cannot say it enough. I'll Call You Right Back got some brand new merch. You could find everything over at I'llCallYouRightBack.com, and I'm going to let yinz go. So without further ado, episode 290 of I'll Call You Right Back podcast with John Schalcosky of Odd Pittsburgh.
Telephone.
Hello?
Telephone.
I'll call you right back. Call you right back.
Telephone.
I'll Call You Right Back podcast. He kind of just became an artist. He would just watch Bob Ross and he would just paint along with everything. And dude, he became great. And
awesome.
It's cool to see. Do you see his son's doing it now?
Yeah, well, he always did. Even in the original series, he would have him as a guest sometimes. He'd come on and paint, which is weird,
That's insane.
And then he'd have that weird woman, Annette, who was like his handler / lover /
oh yeah,
strange old
I forgot
lady.
about her.
Yeah, she came on and painted a couple episodes, as well as his teacher, who was like this guy who he kind of like got inspired on that wet on wet technique.
Yeah.
Bob Alexander was the guy's name.
I remember there was a rumor going around my high school one time that Bob Ross went to my high school, and for years I thought that he did.
Yeah.
And I remember telling people, I was like, Bob Ross went to my high school for sure, and people were like, I don't think he did, and I was just like, no, he did. But yeah, that was like a rumor. I don't know, very weird.
That's weird.
He was a veteran, right?
Yeah, he got stationed in Alaska when he was like, he joined the Army when he was in his 20s. And became a drill instructor, And he was not only a drill instructor for just like a tiny bit, he was that for like 15 years.
Holy shit.
Yeah. And while stationed in Alaska, he would say that the only thing that kept him like calm or peaceful was painting.
That is so crazy.
And
a drill instructor.
That he could control. And I watched this great it was like I got really into like learning about the history of Bob Ross and like beyond what you just see. So like I really started to get into it.
Yeah, like who's this guy that's been painting on my TV for fucking 50 years?
It's crazy. Like even just the way he got his hair and like how he developed that style and like he didn't want to do it, but like he had normal looking hair. That's like a perm. So it was for like why he chose to do that and all these other interesting things. It was just
you went down a rabbit hole on it.
Fascinating guy, yeah. And then his love of animals and all that, and I try to be like that at least a little bit. I try to be peaceful to all the animals around. Like I have this little chipmunk that I feed every day.
Yeah,
he lives in this little pipe in my driveway, and for months, like he knows he'll come to the spot where I feed him, and then like I bought a giant bag of peanuts, and I like crush them up and keep them there, and I have video of them.
That's the best.
My grandpa used to do that too. He would just like go out and feed the birds and just.
You got to be good to animals.
Around,
People that are not good to animals, I don't really like to associate with them.
Yeah.
Something weird about people that just are, maniacal to animals for no reason at all.
Oh yeah, or even like those new bugs. The
lanternflies.
Lanternflies. Like I'm iffy about them because like I don't like them.
Yeah, they're beautiful though.
Well, and not only that, but I think they're really smart. Like if you ever like try to interact with one.
Yeah.
It's like
they'll stare at you.
Yeah, it's
like
real weird.
Extraterrestrials.
Or they'll jump on you. Like I turned my back yesterday and one like jumped. Like he knew I was waiting for it to turn around. It was like it's ridiculous. Yeah. I try to reason with him too. I'm like, hey, go this way and I won't kill you. Please.
We'll go separately.
Yeah. I try to talk to them, but they don't listen.
They're probably aliens, the lanternflies. They're definitely bizarre. They're beautiful though, for sure.
They are. They're crazy. Yeah.
Dude, it's been a while since we have been back together in the studio. You have been through the ringer since you've been in this seat. Your life has been a wild ride, and I mean, I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited that you're up, moving around. I'm excited that you're feeling somewhat better. I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, well, I'm good to be here. Like that's an understatement, for real. It's like I actually don't even know. It's been 9 months since the surgery, almost to the day, and it's it still doesn't feel real. So even every day, it's tough to like almost fathom the amount of things that you go through and like where you were before and where you are now. It doesn't feel like a whole lifetime happened, with just in those couple months, prior to, and then now it's just like this weird, complete curveball thing that you would never expect, never like, think. It wasn't like, it was just like completely a shock out of nowhere with no hints, well, there's hints, which we will talk about because it turned out to be somewhat supernatural in some sense, but it interesting in how your brain reasons with health situations or extreme health, life and death situations. Like what does your brain do, or how does your body prepare yourself? And that we'll talk about that because it is something that I did not expect and something that changed my life forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How long were you in the hospital? Do you know how many total days?
I don't know how many total days, but it was from like February 5th till March 15th or something like that, on and off.
Yeah.
Because I was like sent home for a couple of days and then had to come back. And
4 different surgeries.
Yeah. And including one just a week and a half ago.
Yeah.
The final surgery to put me back together, which is still, I'm still recovering from in many different ways. But yeah, nothing like what happened prior to the surgery, and then during the surgery and after the surgery. It's just really is mind-blowing stuff, especially the stuff that happened before.
Yeah.
Which we will talk about.
Yeah.
We will talk about because
now,
it's
I mean, like, what do you think?
Insane.
So my goal, obviously, you know, we're getting into the Halloween season. You and I have done a Halloween podcast episode before. We have done a Halloween live event at Bottle Rocket, and you know, that was fantastic. Almost a year ago to the day, like 9 days, it'll be a year, October 13th. But sold out show last year while you were sick. We'll get into more of that though later. But like, how do you feel like you want to go about our conversation today? I'm going to let you drive.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things, obviously, we could talk about. Endless amounts of things, really. I mean, there's Pittsburgh and ghosts and the paranormal really go hand in hand. You know, all of history and the paranormal go hand in hand. It's kind of like a dual way of writing history, is to talk about the spooky parts, or the parts that people don't necessarily want to remember, or tragic events, or different things that have occurred in the past that kind of inspire this alternate history, spooky history, that go hand in hand with the regular history. So when I mean regular history, is some guy in 1876 decides to write a book about the history of Pittsburgh. What do you include in that book? Do you just include the stories of, you know, the facts, or do you tell more of the story by filling in these kind of little details of these stories that kind of fill in the gaps, which are sometimes unusual, but which maybe mainstream wouldn't consider history per se. However, every ghost story and every kind of tale is a way of telling history. And so it shouldn't really be discounted. It should be included in the full history of any kind of subject you're talking about, just maybe with a word of caution, or saying maybe this might not be fully be able to be proved, but at least we're going to show you what people believed at the time, tell you all the aspects of it all, and share how these stories continue. Because if it's not, you know, myself or anybody else, you know, talking about these events, then it's as if the events never occurred or never happened. You know, when you look back into your own family history, like we talk about, you know, which we will do an episode on eventually. If you don't talk about your grandparents eventually, who will? Right? It's as if they're like a blip in the radar, and as if they didn't exist, but they did exist. You know, you are them. You are all of history. It's not just your grandparents and your great grandparents, but you're related to literally almost everybody who've ever come before in one way or another. Especially if you have families that lived in America for a long period of time, you can basically find a connection to everybody who's ever lived. So it gets real strange when you start talking about the interconnectedness of history and of us, and how that we are part of this history. And not only are we making history by doing things in this day and age, but we are part of history as well. It's in our DNA. All these stories of Pittsburgh, all these stories of everywhere. It really is inside of you, living and breathing today. And it's up to us to kind of just talk about it and just think about it, you know, especially when it comes to families. Like, just thinking about your grandparents, hopefully, you know, is good enough as a way to remember, because it does fade. You know, people fade and history does fade. So luckily, through the advent of technology now, that we have access to easy records, which previous historians did not have easy access to, old newspaper archives where you can search things by word for the first time, going back to 1700s. You know, so you come across these new tales and new things that have just been lost to time. And you know, my page and what I do is somewhat of a facilitator of that, or at least, you know, if I had to like summarize everything that I've ever done into like one sentence, it would be to remember the dead. You know, to look at any story I've ever posted and look at yourself and see how you could connect to it, because like it matters. You know, history matters. Even the craziest of all stories, you know, there's some kind of interesting story behind it, something that should not be forgotten. You know I don't want to be forgotten. Most people don't want to be forgotten. And you see that time and time again. You know, you go into a cemetery, you just see just a name on a stone and no other information. You know, who is that person? Like it could be anybody. Like, think about if you just ended up as a name on a stone.
Yeah.
with no other references. Like people would have no idea who you are unless you just, someone like me or someone comes around and starts sharing that story. So today, and every time we talk, it's really about that, sharing some of these stories which have been lost to time, which are important stories, stories that matter, stories that connect the past to the present, and see, how we can not only learn from the past, but also how we can improve the future.
And how we can keep the past alive.
Yeah. And then also to explore using technology and using the items and things that we have today to look into the validity of a lot of historical claims. Yeah, a lot of what I do is you find some kind of claim like the birthplace of professional hockey, right? And you say, well, that can't be true, can it? And so then you try to prove it. And you go about the steps of researching old newspapers, looking for any kind of documentation in archives, or go all the different colleges around, just searching all their archives and see if there's any kind of hint of truth to any of these stories that you talk about in any kind of history, let alone, Pittsburgh history, because that just happens to be where I'm at. If I lived somewhere else, I'd be doing the same thing in that spot too. I mean, it doesn't matter where I'm living. It has to do with what you're talking about, and that will go true, especially for our family tree genealogy episode, because it really doesn't matter where you are. I mean, the history will come to you. And so when thinking about what could we talk about today that's different, because we've talked about a lot of things.
Wild stuff.
Our last Halloween episode, not just the live event that we did last year, but then
the actual podcast
2 years ago, I guess it's been 2 years ago, or 3 years ago.
I think it might have been like episode 220.
Yeah, something like that. And where we talked about the boogeyman of Millville, Helltown, all these different, just interesting hauntings and weird things that go bump in the night all over Pittsburgh.
The eyeball through the keyhole.
Oh man.
For people that are listening that have not listened to our previous episode, I strongly urge you, finish this episode because it's going to be great. But the last one is wild as well. Yeah, like whenever I asked you to come over with some stories, Antoinette was like, you think you guys got more stuff? And I looked at her puzzled. I was like, I could just sit here for hours and hours, and I bet you he will never run out of things to talk about. So, yeah, I mean, we did a lot of, it's interesting to think about whenever you talk about history and how you bring up the fact of people, being in cemeteries and you just seeing a headstone with a name that no one really knows anything about. And, one of my favorite things that you always bring up is how someone lives two deaths. And, that's gives me chills anytime you think about it. And I feel that you're your sole purpose is to keep this alive. And I mean, all these stories that we've talked about on these episodes and in our events, I think what's so good about the stuff that you do compared to the run of the mill low hanging fruit, so to say, stories that everyone knows about is you're digging for stuff that has been dead, so to speak, that no one knows about, no one's ever heard about, and no one will probably ever hear about unless they listen to this. Yeah. So it's exciting.
Yeah. It is. And the weird thing about that, what you just said, is I'm conscious of that fact, when I'm researching things. So when I do come across something that no one knows, or people have legit forgotten, and you come across a story that's so big or so epic or so many details involved and the stories of so many people, and it not only is shocking that people have forgotten things. Prime example is the explosion of the Island Queen. It was this little, steamboat on the Allegheny River. I was on the Monongahela River one day. And this was in 1945 or something. It wasn't that long ago. I mean, people are alive today who have witnessed the event or saw it. But this, boat exploded, killing 40 people. Blew out windows all over 2nd Avenue.
What was it? It was like a
steamboat, and some guy was trying to fix some kind of boiler or something on it while most of the people were off of the boat. Thank God, because it could fit 2,000 people or something could fit on this boat.
Yeah.
And while it was parked at shore where people were just fixing it, and some workers were on the boat, and some guy was trying to fix it and caught a spark, and the whole thing exploded.
Jesus.
Photographs of it, and it was gnarly. And huge, tragic event that happened in Pittsburgh history. You
Never
think
heard of that in
anybody's
my
ever
life.
heard of it? No.
So that's not like a common knowledge story?
You think it would be? No.
I would have never known about that. That's pretty wild.
Yeah. Or the fact that, a third of Pittsburgh burned down to the ground in 1845. People you think would remember that. Or like, it goes on and on about these kind of, the Butcher's Run flood. I think we might have even talked about once, like where, the 70 something people were, drowned and things. I mean, you think about the hurricane that's happened now.
Yeah, the flood you're talking about is in downtown Pittsburgh, right?
North side, yeah.
Yeah, it was like up to like the halves of the buildings.
Oh yeah, yeah. It was
wild to even
Butcher's Run,
conceptualize that.
1868 or something like that. And that's just one flood that happened in Pittsburgh, not let alone all the others. And to think about these tragic events, a lot of people don't like to remember those things. So if you talk to an old timer, I'll give you a prime example. There was a horrible murder that happened in the North Hills on Christmas Eve, 1934. I think I might have talked about this on an episode prior. If not, I'll share with you a little bit of the story now, because it is an interesting Halloween-y story, and it's worth bringing up because these people, lost their life. A woman named Catherine Schock, a nurse who was living in Dunkirk, New York, with her sister and her 7-year-old son. Were going about their daily business, and everything seemed to be okay, except the nurse, Catherine, was recently divorced and really trying to get back with her husband. And they had this son together, and the husband did not want to come back. So she slowly started poisoning her son in order to try to get her ex-husband, to say, hey, Jimmy's sick. You should come by and see him, Well, one of these days during that time period, she gave him too much and he died. So not only did that occur, but then her sister, who was, distraught from grief and everything like that, she ended up killing her in the middle of the night. And this is Christmas Eve, she packed up a trunk full of presents in a taxi cab in New York and came all the way down to Perrysville in Pittsburgh, PA, which is the location where her brother, his wife, and 5 children lived. There's a place called Perry Town Tavern, 19. This building was almost directly behind it. It's no longer there. It was torn down maybe in 2002 or something like that. Anyways, she shows up middle of the afternoon. It's still daylight out and everybody's happy to see her. She did come visit prior, so people knew who she was, and she was well liked apparently. And she brought all these presents, so people thought it was a good whatever Christmas time thing, and so they had dinner. And part of the dinner was dessert. And a big dessert, I guess, in 1934, was ginger ale. Just like a yummy drink, ginger ale that they all have. Well, she put cyanide in the ginger ale. Not enough to kill them all, but just enough for them to drink it. And then when they would go to sleep, just kind of never wake up. And then as they were sleeping on that night, she went around and shot everybody in point blank range, including herself.
Jesus Christ.
Now, she didn't kill everybody, unfortunately. 2 of the children survived for about 3 hours, 4 hours. And then her sister-in-law, who was shot in the face and the neck, woke up something like 3-4 hours later, after being this or whatever. And she ran out of the house screaming, found this priest at this church, St. Teresa's church, across the street from kind of where they were at. And he was the one who came to the house and discovered all these people, this mass murder, 7 people murdered in this home. The wife, the one that was shot in the face and the neck, survived. She would later get remarried and have 4 more kids, believe it or not, and lived a happily, good life. I met with those other 4 children and some of their cousins who knew that nurse, because I'm the president of the Ross Township Historical Society. So I had a little dinner party put together, not myself, but some older lady who was related to that whole situation. And I got to meet them all and talk, and they remembered her. They had pictures of her when she was a little girl with them visiting and stuff. And
Jesus.
Yeah, it was, she said, everyone said that she was nice, and you would never thought, this would have happened, but she snapped.
This all came from her not being wanted by her husband, probably, and just
and
went
then
nuts.
she snapped. Yeah, then she snapped.
Jesus.
Yeah. Now, if you look into, and there's a little cemetery behind Brant's funeral home in the North Hills called St. Teresa's Cemetery, and they're all buried there in the one big grave, Christmas Eve,
1934.
all their names on the tombstone. Now, if you go
The Schock family.
yes, well, they were called the Dempsey family. Her name was Catherine Schock, but the people that she murdered were her Dempsey family, Walter Dempsey and his kids. Yeah. So
That was just for people that are listening. That was just a little. That was just something he keeps in his pocket. He just pulled this story out of nowhere. That's nothing of what he even planned to
I
bring.
didn't plan on talking about that. Yes,
That's so crazy.
So here's I guess the example of why I'm talking about this is because growing up in the North Hills, you'd think you would hear the story or you would hear rumors of it. Now, I would go walk in that cemetery all the time as a kid, but I didn't really pay attention to the stones that much. But if you did, you would clearly see that there was a bunch of people with the same death date, and that would get your curiosity piqued. But then being involved in a local historical society, you start meeting some of these old timers, people who were 100 years old. I met with a guy who was 104. And
wow.
It was both interesting and super sad. His kids lived full lives and died, at age 82, and he's still alive.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you, all your friends are dead. It's like it's a weird thing when you get that old.
Yeah.
It's not exactly the greatest, and some people don't like it. Some people do, but I met other people who loved being old, or this one lady who's the lady that I'm going to talk about. Her name was Ruth Dodds. And she turned 100 while I was the president of the Historical Society, because I gave her a plaque before she died. She's dead now. She lived to be 103, I believe.
Wow.
But she was like top of her game. I went to her house. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor. She's like running up and down steps and things. I'm like, man, just to have that kind of energy.
Well, this is a tangential. You're saying 104. My great grandmother, who you looked up, she was, I think, 103 when she died.
Yeah.
But she was spry up until the end.
Yeah, yeah. I had a great aunt who was like, it was my grandmother's aunt who was like that. She was like going down slides and
That's
park
so
and
crazy.
90-something years old. Yeah, so, when you do know people who are that old, or you start developing relationships with these people, or even think about your own ancestors, and then you go through like a health situation like I went through, where you're, wiped out. It's like, to think that I could potentially live another 50 years.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know how they did it. I really don't know how they did it. To think about all the stuff you must have witnessed and thought about and seen, and like what's happened to you, and somehow you survive. So I do look at these old timers, I say that in a loving way, but I look at them as inspiration, and I say like this. I had a lady just recently named Carol who sent me a letter. She's, I think, 94, like literally a hand draw, cursive old school letter I got for, like a get well type of thing, going into detail, just about a little bit about what it's like to be old and still have your mind fresh. Because in here, they're 25 years old, some of them, but physically you're 90, so it's like you just can't do things that you want to do. And so they look upon people like myself or a younger generation to kind of pass this torch on and continue these stories, make sure people don't forget. And that story I told you about, the Christmas Eve murders, is one of those stories. And
you learned that from an old timer.
Well, I learned about it I heard rumors about it like a little bit when I started going to that cemetery and I saw that tombstone, and there's like just a headline that you can find on findagrave.com or something like that says like, oh, this was because they were all murdered and not just because of natural causes or whatever. I'm like, what is going, I've never seen this, or no one's ever talked about it.
Yeah.
Ruth Dodds, that lady, she was there, she lived one block away, when this was going on. She was born in 1915, she was 30 years old when World War I, she was alive during World War I, we got one of the first people to vote, women, it was like talking to somebody like that who saw those types of horrible things or went through that, is something. I talked to that same older guy too, who was 104, Bill Kaiser was his name. His story is fascinating, but he too talked about, and the thing that they told me was that, why would you want to talk about that? It's like, that's horrible. It's like the worst thing that ever happened in the North Hills. Why would you even bring that up? It's like, we try to forget that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And so, and that's the kind of duality of being a historian and also talking about these kind of weird subjects is like, how much do you want to like, keep like the respect of the dead versus, the reality and the truth of what happened. And if I didn't talk about that story, you would not know that there was a guy named Walter Dempsey, whose 5 kids were killed. Yeah, like you just wouldn't even know. And it's like I'd rather at least know. And even though it's morbid to talk about like what happened and the after effects and everything, I have photographs of the funeral. I have photographs of the burial. I have photographs, and that's all come since doing lots of research. I should have brought them, but I didn't realize I was going to talk about it.
Yeah.
I have the original newspapers from 1934, front page news.
Jeez.
To put it in perspective, the Amityville Horror was a similar situation in the effect that somebody in the family killed their entire family in the house. That was 5 total people. This was 7.
My goodness.
Now, and on Wikipedia, there's a bunch of weird lists, and one of the lists is called Family Side, which is when the situation when somebody in the family kills their whole family. It's like in the number top 20. This particular event, it's in the history of recorded incidents like this. There was a woman in Bellevue who killed 5 kids, 1945. So there's like it happens.
What's the story behind that? Are they her kids?
Yeah, and her that story that happened at 240 Lincoln Avenue. I remember the address. And if you go to the CVS in
Someone's
Bellevue,
listening to this and they're like, "Holy shit, that's my address."
well, if you go at the CVS in Bellevue and park there and look across the street, that's 240 Lincoln Avenue, and that's where in the 1940s this story was a little different. This one was a lady who, most likely due to postpartum depression,
Yeah.
and other things, was suicidal in general. And decided the same type of thing, like didn't want her kids to see her go through it or whatever that case may be. And while her husband was out at work, she killed everybody. And the husband found everybody that following morning. And like I actually have the coroner's report and the police reports from all the events, and it's in the guy's own handwriting from the things he witnessed. I mean, it's insane to see documents like that and just how much tragedy that went on. He was innocent. He didn't kill him. I mean, it was like clear what happened. It was just like super tragic.
Yeah, that's insane.
That house was part of a seance in the 1970s, KDKA, with the old John Cigna back in the day. Wanted to pick a house, and asked Pittsburgh, is there anybody here who has a haunted house that we could come to on Halloween and we do like some sort of seance or a ghost hunting type of thing. And this was like in the precursor of ghost hunting days. And they did. And there's I don't have the recording of that one, but I did find another recording that they did of a similar type of house. And it's like a 4-hour long live episode on KDKA where they did like straight from the home, like a seance.
Jeez.
It's crazy. Yeah. And, but then again, you ask anybody in Bellevue if they've ever heard this story, and either they'll say yes, and it's because I said it, or they saw it on Facebook, which was because I put it there.
Yeah.
Or they've never heard of it ever. Same with Bellevue's House of Mystery, which is a whole like a weird abortion house that was who knows how many women and babies were killed in this place. That's a story for another day.
Jesus.
But if you don't talk about those things, you would never know. And is that a good thing? Maybe just to people who don't want to think about bad things, but is it a good thing? Yeah, because like you really would just be lost. You'd be just a forgotten blip on the map, as if your life. These little kids. I mean, there was Walter Jr. who was like 9 years old. I mean, like I got kids. Like I have a 7-year-old. It's like hopefully, if something were to happen, like I would want them to be remembered.
Yeah.
Even if it's because of their death is how they're remembered. It's one way, to remember the dead. And so like once I found out that type of story, these tragic stories, and realized that I could make an impact, like personally, I could like bring these people back to life in a sense, just for a couple minutes, just for whoever's listening, I could bring them back to life just for a couple minutes, just so you could think about them. I mean, hopefully that's kind of like, doing, what's right by humanity or what's right by, anybody.
Yeah.
Is like to not forget those people who came before, no matter how tragic their end might have been. if that murder didn't happen, would we even know who they were also? So there's like, it's duality to all this type of stuff.
That's an interesting point as well. If there wasn't such this catastrophic event, would there be anything that would, start up this, historical, rebirth of them, kind of?
Yeah. So that's
a pretty grim way to look at it, but I mean, like, that's the reality of it.
It is. And I guess that will kind of lead us into the first subject that I kind of wanted to talk about specifically for this show.
Half hour of just crazy stories that just came out of your mind.
Exactly. So, what? Here's an old map of Pittsburgh. Okay, and I just want to this is from 1795.
Now hold this up, and here, I'll hold this up. Now, for people that are listening, hop over to YouTube. This is the first time that John and I are able to have a conversation with video footage where, you guys could see the materials that he brings. Whenever we have these episodes, he brings, the first time we talked, you brought that whole binder and you didn't even open it.
Yeah.
So, here, if you're watching this, you obviously could see it. But again, if you're listening to it, you could see everything if you hop over on YouTube. But you said that this is a map of what?
That's downtown Pittsburgh, 1795. And to really pay attention to these strange islands, because you'll notice, if you drive down through Pittsburgh, there's no islands. So what happened to those islands? There's got to be a story involved, right? Not only those islands, but there's also ponds in the middle of downtown Pittsburgh. That's pretty strange. Did anybody ever tell me that there was not only islands all surrounding Pittsburgh, but also strange ponds going through downtown? No one ever taught me this or told me this. And so when you come across a map and you say, okay, well, what are these strange islands? Do they have a name? Do they have a story? And of course, everything has a story. And the story of this map from 1795, which is kind of the end result of a lot of stuff that happened prior. So, and we're going to talk about the earliest, not the earliest history of Pittsburgh, because that, no one knows. It's been here for a million years, so, I always like to talk about that. Like, people think, let's talk about Pittsburgh history. I'm like, what era? Like the Jurassic era. Let's talk about the history of Pittsburgh in the Jurassic era. Were there dinosaurs here in Pittsburgh? All those types of questions. Pretty interesting answers, which we've talked about, I think, prior.
Yeah.
So, but as far as people are concerned, who controlled these three rivers? It was pretty evident to all early people in North America, all of them, everybody who settled in North America from the very beginning, pretty much once they discovered that there was indeed these three rivers, and that this third river, the Ohio River, could not only, you could take that river all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's where it pops out. It pops out at the Gulf of Mexico, and because the Ohio River eventually becomes the Mississippi River, which the Mississippi River eventually goes all the way down through Texas and out into the, or Louisiana, out into the Gulf of Mexico. So trade and the importance of, getting things to and fro, and how you could transport these goods, which the easiest way prior to railroads and prior to a road system was by river. And whoever controlled those rivers controlled the world. And at least the early American world that was prevalent in this time period. And it all really stems down to, who does Pittsburgh belong to? Who does it belong to?
Yeah, I guess.
Does it belong to the Native Americans?
Yeah, because, I guess, yeah,
does it belong to the French? Does it belong to Britons? Does it, the English? Does it belong to North Americans? Like, who does it belong to? So, unfortunately, the answer to that question is like one of those hardball answers that it's not a pretty answer. And the answer to who owns Pittsburgh is whoever fought for it and won.
Yeah, whoever took it.
Yeah, and that's literally how all land, all cities, all countries on Earth
they were
are founded. This is not like a new concept. You look at what's going on in all over the world. That's fight for territory remains. It's never going away. It's sad, to think about how we can't just all share it. But of course, in this time period, whoever really did own these kind of junction of the three rivers really did control all of trade, all of kind of, anything passing through this area to the south of, to all of North America at the time. Nobody knew what was west of Pittsburgh. Back then, it was just called the Ohio Country. And even prior to that, beyond the Ohio Country was just literally the wilderness. Like nobody knew until Lewis and Clark, went, and that was like in the 1800s.
Yeah.
So prior to that, some people I'm sure ventured out, but like for them to even come back and tell somebody what is over there, was a hard thing to do. You would hear stories from Native Americans that you'd run into, and they would tell you, oh yeah, 100 miles this way is where this thing is or whatever. But even they, it was hard for them to travel around long distances.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, really up in the arms that like, who does Pittsburgh belong to? Belongs to the victors, which is, how all the these early things come to be. But how you got there and how you remember all these things and people that came and how it became to be is where it gets interesting and tragic. So the first kind of known people to come through this area were the French, first like Europeans.
What year?
It's debatable because there was a guy who possibly did it in the 1660s.
Okay.
But the 100%, there was a guy named Celeron who, in like one name like Cher, or Sting, Celeron, and he did have a bigger name. Celeron de Blainville was his full name. He actually had an even bigger name than that. But he was a French explorer who was paid by the government of New France, which was Canada at the time, to explore Western Pennsylvania and to see if there is a connection of these rivers, because no one really kind of came through Pittsburgh. It was just rumors there was like frontiersmen or random people out here, but not a lot. And so he decided to start at Lake Erie, essentially, work his way down the Allegheny until met here. And then what his job was to bury these lead plates. And I think we talked about that. One. And he would bury these lead plates, and they were about as big as a
You've seen
piece
one.
of paper. Yeah. They were actually a little bit smaller than like a piece of paper. And they all say the same thing. But there's differences when it talks about the latitude and longitude and the date of whenever he was at a certain area. They would mark what the longitude and latitude is and what the date is, and they'd bury it. Some stories say that people just, as soon as he'd bury it, as soon as he'd leave, they would just pick it up and throw it in the river. Others, they're still buried. There's been 3 found, and there's one buried in Allegheny County. No one's ever found it. I do know some potential locations, because he most likely buried it at, 2 places. One is either Logstown, which is kind of like Ambridge, and the other would be the Indian village that was kind of by the 40th Street Bridge.
Yeah.
In Bloomfield.
And it's a little lead block that's like inscribed on the back.
Yeah.
What was the photo that you brought previously?
That was of one of the ones that was found.
But what was what was like scraped on the back of it though?
Oh, that was from the 1660s.
Okay,
that was a different one. That was insane. That was like same thing, a French explorer burying these lead
was his
plates.
name?
His name was Chevalier.
Yeah, Chevalier.
Chevalier de La Salle.
De La Salle, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
And his story is fascinating as well. But
you guys got to listen to a previous episode. We go all about that. This was, like he said, 1660. Some guy was metal detecting, contacted John, has the actual plate.
Yeah, found
absolutely
one, yeah.
Insane.
It's insane. I held it in my hand. It was insane.
Insane.
What makes it crazier is that there's no way you could fake it. There would be no way for
anyone to even know that was a thing.
Like, it took me a while to figure out and try to find out if this is even semi-true, and which it is. But it took a long time just to try to find those facts, because the guy's diaries were destroyed. And
that's so interesting to think about, like how people like claimed that they were in an area is just like, burying these plates that have like their initials on there, or just like, putting their mark on an area. And like, that's just wild to think about that.
I mean, it's just like, Marvin the Martian, I claim this in the name of Mars, or no, it's claim
your flag.
In the name of Earth. Yeah. People claim this area in the name of France. And that's just how it was for almost 100 years. No one really debated it until the 1750s.
Yeah, so this is 1660 that this guy claimed it from France?
Right. So Celeron comes around in 1749,
Yeah.
which kind of seals the claim of France
Yeah.
in this area. And then people start moving in. So the French start building these kind of little not forts like you would think, like real big forts, like small little encampments essentially along the rivers, including here at the Three Rivers. One of early American history's kind of cool stories was a young George Washington in his early 20s.
My second cousin.
Yeah, exactly. A redhead, tall guy, and he kept a journal of every day of his life during that time period. And you can read it online and read about his experience coming through Pittsburgh and what it was like when it was still kind of French occupied.
George Washington's cousin?
George Washington.
Or George Washington, yeah.
And
this is available online to read.
Yeah, his entire diary.
Cool.
From 1753, which is really cool document to read because he was, and not to go into too many details about who George Washington was, but or why he joined up the army. But his job was kind of like a messenger boy, or kind of like a person who would deliver messages in dangerous areas.
Interesting.
So he would take up like an interesting message and be in charge of getting it to Lake Erie, for example. And that's exactly why he came to Pittsburgh the first time, was through Virginia, and then through Pittsburgh, and then through like Route 19, all the way up to through Butler County, all the way up to Granbury, Zelienople. Like he literally traveled that north route until he got to Lake Erie, where he was supposed to hand deliver this message to a French commander saying, "Hey, you guys got to abandon all your weird little forts you got around Pittsburgh and all over the place here in Western Pennsylvania and get out because the British are now in control of this, not the French." Now I'm summarizing, of course. But that's essentially what the letter said. And as he was traveling back to Pittsburgh or back to Virginia, he was staying out near Fayette County in the middle of the woods. And they came across a small encampment of French soldiers, about 15 people there in the woods. And he didn't know what to do, George Washington. I mean, they weren't really enemies at that point. There was no war per se. There was no like any kind of reason to do anything to them. But traveling with him traveling with George Washington was this Native American half chief called the Half King, Tanacursian. Really interesting story.
Is that
about
one
this
name,
guy.
Tanacursian?
Yeah, and he was a fascinating guy. And
that's a sick name.
so him traveling, the Half King, also it's just an interesting thing what you think about this guy. Traveling with George Washington himself was only traveling with like 20 something guys. They're in the woods. They see these French people. They know that they think they see guns, so they know it's kind of like hostile. What do? They just kind of like sneak and think the French don't hear them, or do they go approach them? I mean, what do you do? And George Washington, in kind of like a weird spark of inspiration, decided to tell his men to fire upon the French soldiers without them knowing, right? And totally ambushed this little encampment near a place called Jumonville Glen, which is in Fayette County. So this happens. The person who's leading this little French commandment is horribly not just murdered, but this Tanacursian comes up to them. And before Washington can even say anything, he splits the guy's head in half with a tomahawk.
Jesus.
Pulls out his brains, this French commander, washes his hands with his brains, then scalps him and tells Washington, he's like, now, I've given them a sign now. Now this is, we washed our hands of his blood and this is, like this, we're putting an end to this guy's life. Washington was like, he could not believe it. He was enthralled by it. He said he never felt more alive than the time that he was at the Battle of Jumonville Glen.
Jeez.
Turns out the guy that they killed, this French commander, happened to be the brother of the guy who just was visiting in Lake Erie to deliver this message for the French to get out of this territory. And once that guy found out, he was like, well, this means war. And that event sparked a war that would go on to last for 7 years, called the French and Indian War.
No way.
It was because of that one. Well, there was more to it because there was, tensions on both sides, but that event is what caused them to go to war, like officially go to war. And it wasn't just happening here in America, but it was also in France and England being fought over there as well. But
Wow.
the Pittsburgh connection all kind of stems from that event. These people that were just randomly murdered in the woods, during the height of battle, and kind of started this kind of ripple effect, which would not end well. And so why I wanted to bring this up and talk about it is just really about three events. Now, there was lots of events of people coming in, and it was hard to like settle at Fort Pitt or, like a place to live in downtown Pittsburgh for a long time because of the hostilities that were going on and who controlled the fort. So there's stories from every little battle, that occurred. And some were just skirmishes where maybe like a couple people were murdered or a couple people killed. Others were mass battles where insane casualties occurred. And we're going to talk about those particular battles. And why I want to talk about that aspect of it is, when you go down to Point State Park today, I just drove past it. It's beautiful. You got the fountain, you have all the park, it's just people flying kites, it's just a nice, happy looking time. I mean, I'm sure there's stuff that goes on down there, but in general, happy environment.
Yeah.
Not really when it comes to Pittsburgh history. And when I look at the fort, and I'm driving past it, I'm like looking where the fort was. I don't think about, I do try to think about the positive all the time, but I also think about the negative. And not the negative, but just how many people died in downtown Pittsburgh. I'll take a guess of just from the battles from the French and Indian War, which was like from 1753 to 1763. Or 1755 to 1763. Just
So
that.
That's 8 years.
Yeah, just a little over 7 years. Yeah.
I don't know, 5,000?
Close. But it's under, let's say, under 2,000.
Okay. Under 2,000. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, like I couldn't even conceptualize, because as soon as I said 5,000, I'm like, that's not as many people. There wasn't even as many people back then. So
True.
Yeah.
Now, like,
what would that could equate to today, you think?
well, try to conceptualize what 50 people dead
yeah.
would be like.
Well, anything would be catastrophic, but back then, what was the population back then, do you think, compared to what it is now?
Small.
And like, if you scale that up to those numbers and you equate that ratio, it would be mind-blowing.
Yeah. One of the battles, which I will talk about, is we'll get into that statistic because it will shock you.
You said that all these 2,000 people were all killed over 3 events, basically?
In just these 3 events, yeah. Now,
That's insane.
well, here's the craziest thing is the third thing might have contributed to the death of 1 million people.
Holy shit.
So the first thing, now, like I mentioned, everyone's trying to fight for, or who controls the point.
Yeah.
The French or the British or the Native Americans, right? Who could control that? Native Americans were friendly with anybody who was friendly with them.
Yeah.
Or anybody that they could know that they could benefit from. And since the first contact, they were getting supplies of guns and ammo. It wasn't just Native Americans running around with tomahawks and bows and arrows. They were like stocking up with like the most high-tech weaponry of the time, provided by the U.S. government. There's essentially, well, not the U.S. government because they didn't exist, but provided by the governmental people in charge, either the French or the English, would supply people with as much ammo and as many guns as they wanted. So they were like a hybrid force.
Yeah.
Not to be messed with.
Yeah, they were able-bodied.
Yeah. They didn't.
It's so scary to even think about that, because like if you think about soldiers who are dependent on the technology that they have, obviously they have some skills for survival, but like a Native American who has spent their lives back then surviving with the means that they had, to also have the means of having firearms as well, terrifying to think about.
Yeah, and they didn't fight like, for some reason, back in the day, people thought you had to like fight in a proper with manners, and
like Gettysburg in a line. That's the craziest
that's just
thing
Gettysburg.
to think about.
So think about how primitive it was even prior to 100 years prior to that.
They like take turns. You have a shot, and then I'll have a shot.
It almost was like that. It was almost
crazy.
like that. In fact, a lot of these battles were lost because of the fact that they were trying to get back into like a straight line of people to refire. And meanwhile, while they were doing that or were trying to reload it, they would be shot at from all angles. I mean, the Native Americans were hiding in trees, behind bushes, behind like every, they had no rules to combat other than, you're dead. And they didn't mess around. They didn't like just say, I'm going to shoot you, then just keep on running. I mean, they shot you
and they tomahawked you like Mel Gibson did in The
ripped
Patriot.
off your, literally just skulls, like your souvenirs.
They made a point. They like made you a point for other people to see.
Or captured you and made you a slave.
Yeah.
And most people who were captured would stay with tribes for a decade before being released. A decade.
That's insane.
Some would turn sides too. Some would flip sides because they, we're talking a lot about violence occurred by them, but there obviously is a lot of peaceful things too. And people did like incorporate each other and kind of lived in a little bit of a harmonious balance in some sense.
And benefited from each other's cultures probably.
Even though they might have been captured, and you hear stories about this every other week in that time period of like whole families being massacred and then them like stealing the kids, and then the kids would grow up and become either fight for the Native Americans or fight against them or get married into the families, and they'd have like very strange.
Let me ask you a random question because it's literally burning in my head right now. Why do you think that back in the day their tactics of fighting were as dumb as they were? Like I'm literally thinking of the battles of Gettysburg and stuff like that, and people just literally being in a line and just like everyone staring at each other, like raising up their muskets, everyone cocking, and all just shooting at one time. It's like, why do you think that was the mentality back then?
It was either it's hard to really know because
the reason I asked that is you brought up like people have formality on how they're fighting. Is that I guess that was like incorporated into what it was back then.
Yes and no. So yes, in the fact that it was trying to organize or trying to think that you can win it on a map beforehand and then say, okay, I'm going to actually perform this battle. So they would plan it out. And you'd say, okay, this line would come in from this way. Meanwhile, I'd have this one coming up the back or whatever, and the line behind that, and the line behind that. So everything would be really try to be planned out. It wasn't so much of a willy-nilly, let's go in and just shoot. It was like, here's how we're going to plan this battle.
Yeah, you have a line, shoot, fall back, let the next line who already has their guns loaded shoot, and then while you're reloading, and it's like that. Yeah. I guess that makes sense.
So it's
crazy though.
It's certainly silly, especially when you're like standing in an open field. Yeah, it'd be different if you're hiding behind a rock or something. And
all I'm thinking is the cannonball scene rolling on the field and just taking that guy's leg out in the Patriot.
Yeah.
Just so crazy to think about that.
Well, so and we're going to talk about that exact type of situation because it really did become an interesting way of looking at how to win battles, or what does it consist to be a hero or a villain in a battle. So that's one kind of philosophical thing when you talk about these events that happened. Who is the winner? Who is the loser? Why? And just because you happen to be from France, does that mean you're just an automatic loser and that you shouldn't be remembered because of whatever, the end result was that, Great Britain took over Fort Pitt. And so everything that you did here for a decade just doesn't matter anymore. How do you incorporate the fact of these people who were brave fighting on both sides? It's kind of a weird thing to say that there's heroes on both sides. You don't want to come across as some kind of weird.
No, but that makes sense. That's interesting that you're bringing that up because I feel like that. I don't know. I never really thought about it that way. There's usually a negative side that you think about, and people just.
Well, you think about like the descendancy of that side. So like we are the recipients of the British coming in here and kind of saving the day right from the French. At least that's what we kind of like think, or that we kind of descend, even though Great Britain became our enemy, just 30 years after these events, right? So then so North Americans, right? Then are the heroes, and not the British now, but the British are the ones who saved us. You know, so it's like, but all France. You know, so it's like always questions, and the truth is,
It's complex.
very hard and very complex.
It's complex
because it's like, in reality, who are the victors, and like, who should we be celebrating? Should we be celebrating just everybody who fought in the battles? And that's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
I look at it that we just talk about everybody involved.
Yeah.
And not put some kind of hero or villain title or opinion just because of what we know now. I look about the events that were occurring the day of, and how people reacted to that. And I'm going to share with you.
Well, let me ask you this. Now, just to be devil's advocate,
Yeah.
how do you do that in a way when there's I'm sure some situations that you're speaking about are a little bit more unclear on who is the victor and the loser, but then you have people that are like Hitler that obviously did ridiculous things that are just, known to be what they are, and it's just like an absolute ridiculousness. And it's like, how could you give sides like that their flowers, so to speak?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's difficult. I mean, 30 million people, supported that whole idea in Germany.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do you,
But also, to be devil's advocate, it's like, how do you look at it?
You can't be, I would say you can't be blind to the fact that there could possibly be any kind of
information that you could take from that
would be beneficial for you today.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Understanding.
Yeah. I mean, like, the way things go down, that's another debate, but the outcome of those things can be seen in multiple views. That goes for literally everything. I mean, there's a right and a wrong, or a good and a bad.
Yeah, it's
black
a
and a
loaded
white
thing.
Yeah, it's the yin and the yang, I guess, of history. That's the best way to put it.
Yeah, I feel like it all really comes down to the person interpreting it,
Right,
and how they're doing it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And so, like, I'm going to share with you a story about a man who, I mean, I would consider him like somewhat of a hero per se, or definitely not, maybe not a hero, but a pretty brave guy beyond other brave guys.
Yeah.
And
a pretty brave guy.
And the only way, there's a lot of stories, like how you find out these stories are either by firsthand accounts that were written down in old notes and old letters that were passed back and forth and mailed. Therefore, someone kept them in some archive somewhere. Or you hear about them from previous histories that were written about Pittsburgh. And this particular story I read about in the baptismal registry of Fort Duquesne. Now, Fort Duquesne was only around for a few years. That was the precursor to Fort Pitt.
What year?
It was built around 1753.
Okay.
And it only lasted till it'll be the 1760s. So because the French abandoned it, and they blew it up, and they just left it smoldering ruins.
You're saying you read this, though, from the...
This is from the baptismal. So during the time when Fort Duquesne was around, they kept detailed records, the French.
Yeah.
Of day-to-day things. Like I have receipts for how many pairs of pants were made, on a certain day, or, just what the food supplies were. And just from very basic.
It's pretty fascinating.
It is, so like just that basic information tells you things about them.
Yeah.
Like what were they eating? If I was around here, like, do I just eat raccoons? Like, what am I eating? Like, and it wasn't as bad as I thought.
You got to link me to some of this stuff.
Yeah, reading the first-hand accounts is neat.
I would love to read old journals like that. That's really, really fascinating.
To touch them is even cooler. I went down to the History Center, this is 15 years ago maybe, when I was starting getting into North Hills history, and there was a guy named Casper Reel. In his account, he worked or like served at Fort Pitt in the 1760s, and his book of like day-to-day activities exists.
Holy shit.
And I could look at it. So like I'm flipping page by page in this book from the 1760s.
Insane.
The coolest thing, and I don't know if we've talked about him before, and we will have to talk about him in detail someday. This guy named Simon Girty.
That might sound familiar.
Simon Girty was known as the white savage or the renegade.
Huh. That does sound familiar, kind of.
His family was murdered by Native Americans when he was a kid. He was adopted by a Native American family, grew up to love them. And when all these wars started breaking out, he fought. He was he was not only an interpreter for some of the native tribes to some of the people that were coming through Pittsburgh, but was seen as like a guy who played both sides.
Yeah.
And kids growing up in early Pittsburgh history would be threatened with the ghost of Simon Gerty. Say like, hey, you kids aren't good, Simon Gerty's going to get you. You know, or like if you
Boogeyman.
come back in the woods. Yeah, he was a boogeyman of early American history. There's multiple full-on novels about the Simon Gerty.
Really?
Yeah, written by Zane Grey, who's like a guy who wrote all these famous Western novels that you can find.
Wow.
Multiple books about this guy. No one really knows his really true story. I've met some of his descendants, which is crazy because they kept his skull after he died in his 1820s. Yeah, in this weird place in Canada because he ended up dying in Canada, and that's where his bones are and stuff like this. Anyways.
That's a story for another day.
So Simon Gerty, though, he was around during all these things that were going on. But the reason I'm not talking about him today, I'm talking about one of these unsung heroes.
Yeah, that you read about in the baptismal 17.
Yes. Baptism. It's actually from 1754 to 1756 is when the registry existed. And this registry is unique in the fact that it has a list of everyone ever born, married, and died in Pittsburgh during those exact years.
Wow.
Day to day, full-on baptismal certificates of the French who were born here. So making them the first technically non-native people to be born in Pittsburgh. That's what this book contains. So the first kid ever born and died here, unfortunately, was a guy named John Daniel Norbit. And he was only like a week and a half old when he died.
Okay, yeah.
But his birth and his death are both notated in that book. And all the people who died in that book, which was about 40 of them listed, are all buried somewhere at the point. No one knows where, but they're definitely there because, I mean, this is what that registry is from. So, and I have talked to an archaeologist who was at one of the times when they dug up down there and they did find mass graves.
When did they do that? Like what years?
Multiple times, because in the 1960s when they were doing the park, they uncovered the thing called the Music Bastion, which was like a little mini Star Lake that they had there at Fort Pitt, and they reburied it along with multiple walls of the fort.
Jeez,
a whole bunch of stuff. It's actually kind of secretive, like the extent to what they found is only found in these really rare archaeological journals. Which is like there's only I don't know how many
from
copies
the 60s
exist.
you said?
Yeah.
And this was like a big this was a huge dig.
Huge.
Okay, yeah.
And then but then also they've done multiple minor archaeological things like around the blockhouse. And they don't want them to dig it all up, so they only go like so far down.
That's pretty wild to think about.
It is. So what's even more wild to think about is after I'm done talking to you about these different events that occurred down there, why there's no sign or anything even telling you that
happened.
That happened. Not only that happened, but just the baptismal registry of Fort Pitt, which we know everybody's names, exact dates of birth, and exact dates of death. There's nothing to remember these people by other than that book.
John Edward Norbit.
Yeah, and I have John Daniel.
Yeah. It gave me chills when you said that, just because, like, who the fuck would know that until you bring it up on this right now?
Yes.
Now everyone heard that dude's name, and they're like, randomly, they hear that. I don't know why. It gives me chills to think about that.
It is weird. I think, and here's the weird thing is that, unlike other people, maybe, when I go down to the fort or down to that area, I think about that.
Yeah.
And so, and I think about this guy. I think about this guy a lot. And that's the story. It's kind of like the first battle to happen in Pittsburgh. So while people were venturing out and they shouldn't be where they, or in the middle of the woods or whatever, and they would get murdered or massacred or whatever, those were kind of isolated incidents. There was no real big battle that happened, not until this event. So here's the man we're going to talk about.
Chevalier Léonard de Beaujeu.
Yeah, Daniel Léonard de Beaujeu.
Wow.
Now,
he's a wild-looking guy.
Yeah, young guy. He's wearing a wig, obviously, but a young guy. And I'm going to tell you the little story about his involvement with early Pittsburgh history. Now, he, if you were alive during that time period, would be considered the enemy not only the enemy, like the king of the enemies. He was the commander at Fort Duquesne. He was in charge of it all. Right now, this story, which usually when you look up American history or pick any book written about Pittsburgh other than this one, and I mean, every historical history of Pittsburgh, there's one in 1908, one in 1876, one in 1850. There are multiple other ones, the one from the 1960s. None of them talk about this. They talk about this guy, but not this event. They all talk about the event from the other side, the side that lost this particular battle, and that's the British, because that's our kind of history that we were told that those were the right people to support, and not these other people, the French, who were just here. So this story involved General Edward Braddock, who was Braddock. The town of Braddock is named after because of this one of these events here that I'm going to talk about. And actually, this particular battle is the one that that's why Braddock is called Braddock, is because of this particular battle. Now, this is a crazy story. So the end result of this battle was that Braddock would eventually he was shot, mortally wounded. He would die on his way traveling back to Philadelphia. George Washington would take command of this mini army. This was just 2 years after that event that happened in the middle of the woods.
Okay.
And this event, this big military campaign, is kind of what promoted him or made him more of a higher up in the ranking of the actual army, per se, versus just a messenger boy prior. This is kind of like what stepped him up. And, but like I mentioned, there's stories on both sides.
Yeah.
And this is a story from the other side about this guy, Chevalier Leonard de Beaujeu. And it was I'm going to read the actual excerpt from the baptismal registry. On the morning of July 9th, 1755, Daniel Leonard de Beaujeu, a captain of the French army and the commander of Fort Duquesne, prayed in the chapel of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin of the Beautiful River. That was the name of the church that they gave right at the Three Rivers. Knowing full well what task was waiting ahead of him, Beaujeu could not bring himself to wait tamely at the fort and be crushed, or to retreat in inglorious haste. He would not give up Fort Duquesne without striking a powerful blow or making a difference. After a previously failed attempt to convince the Native American leaders around the fort to join him in battle, he returned with a powerful speech. Now, to give you some background, like I mentioned earlier, Native Americans would help you if you could help them. They were for whoever would help each other. I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so he caught wind that not only was this guy, General Edward Braddock, coming here, the top guy in the U.S. government, or not, it wasn't the U.S. government, but of the British Army at that time period, was coming this way. He was having an expedition, in fact. He was like trying to push everything from where he started up until the point where he got to Pittsburgh. He's trying to push everything out, especially any kind of French influence. He's trying to get out of this valley. Captain Daniel de Beaujeu, kind of caught wind that there was a lot of people coming here. And he here in Pittsburgh had 72 soldiers and 146 Canadian militiamen. And that was it. Those were the only people that he had at Fort Duquesne that could fight if they needed to. And he was going up.
He had 200 and some.
About 200 people.
Yeah.
On contrast, there was about 1,200 people in Braddock's army coming this way.
Oh, shit.
1,200. So he knew that the only way he's ever going to even come close to defeating this or surviving is to try to convince the Native Americans around here to fight with him. And how do you do that? So he, after one previously failed attempt, he went back down to Logstown, which is Ambridge today. That's kind of where the council was for all Native American chiefs and different representatives of different tribes. They all that was like their home base. He said this exact speech. He said, "I am determined to go and meet the enemy. Will you let your father go alone? I'm sure to beat them." And they ignored him, and they wouldn't. They did not want to help him until he came back. And he says, "Join me. I'm your brother. I will fight for you. I know what's best for you." And with that, he ripped off his uniform, donned their war paint, and literally like held a charge like Animal House style, like, who's with me? Let's go. And this like shocked some of the leaders there. And they said, look at this guy. You know, if he's willing to do this, fight like us, he's like, let's do it. And so he convinced 600 Native Americans
Wow.
to come and start like fortifying downtown Pittsburgh. Especially, and then also to march further down to see and try to maybe ambush this General Braddock who's coming near Kenny. By this time, he was already by Kennywood.
Wow.
And he was trying to cross the river right around that area of Kennywood across the Monongahela River. Braddock is across the river there. So they crossed the river and fighting in that same company, the people that were coming with Braddock was not only a young George Washington, but also Daniel Boone. Simon Girty was involved there, and a bunch of other big name people from like the Frontier Pass. You would recognize their names, but you wouldn't think that they would be here in Pittsburgh in some kind of random little militia, but they were. Captain Beju's plan to ambush the English at one of the crossings of the Monongahela failed, and because they arrived too late and the British were already crossing the river. After spotting the English, Beju let out a war cry and led the charge. The Native Americans glided along the woods on either side of the English, terrifying whoop sounds and screams, causing fear and panic to break out in the British army because they seemed to be fighting an invisible enemy shooting at all angles. They would only be seen, in fact, darting out to scalp people that they just shot. After a third volley from the English, Captain was seen darting out, and he fell, pierced through the forehead with a musket ball. It was Captain Daniel. His death did not dishearten his men, for it only made them stronger with the ambition to wipe out the British. Finally, after close to 3 hours of intense combat, Braddock was shot in the lungs, possibly by one of his own men, and that resistance collapsed. He fell from his horse, badly wounded, and was carried back to safety by his men. And as a result, Braddock's wounding, and without any kind of orders being given, the British began to withdraw. They did so until they reached the Mon River, where they were set upon by even more Native American warriors. The Indians attacked with hatchets, scalping knives, and panic spread the troops by this time period. I mean, literal panic. People didn't know some of these people have never seen a fight ever. And you figure you join up the army to kind of get that out of your service and serve your country.
You have people running through the woods, cutting your head off.
And you're like, yeah. And then you get these, insane things happening in front of you, and you're scared. You start running away. As you run away, that's when someone jumps out and, it's crazy.
Hearing hooting and hollering in the woods that you can't even see it. That's like,
yeah. So George Washington, although he had he didn't have any kind of official position at all in the chain of command, he was able to somehow get some kind of order together and get some of the people to form sort of rear guard so that people could escape and try to get away as much as they could. But by sunset, the surviving British forces were sent back fleeing down the road, carrying any wounded they could. Behind them on the road, bodies were piled high. The Indians did not pursue the fleeing redcoats, but instead set about scalping and looting the corpses and the wounded and the dead, and drinking over 200 gallons of captured rum. That meant, George Washington himself reported, "We have been beaten, shamefully beaten by just a handful of men." Of the approximate 1,200 people that Braddock was leading into battle, 500 were killed.
Jeez.
And just outright, and 422 were wounded.
Wow.
Of the 50 or so women that accompanied them, like the wives and the kids, 4 survived. They were either raped, murdered, and or captured and taken as prisoners. The French and Canadians, meanwhile, reported under 30 people killed.
30 people?
Yeah. The body of the brave French commandant was sent back to Fort Duquesne and was buried in a now long lost grave somewhere near the point.
This guy is buried in the point.
Captain Daniel Beju fell in the arms of victory, dying boldly as any other crusader who came before him, and by the success of turning a desperate cause into a triumphant defeat of a much superior force. So that's like the quote about this guy.
This dude is buried in the point?
Yeah.
This is insane.
And he was this guy who inspired hundreds of Native Americans to come fight with him by literally ripping off his clothes and putting on their war paint. I mean, could you imagine
No.
the scene of
Pretty wild.
Yeah, and not only that, but he didn't fight in that kind of goofy line like you were talking about. Like he fought just like them, like hiding in the trees, trying to.
How old do you
ambush
think
these
that guy
people.
was?
Oh, I mean, he couldn't have been. He was probably 30 something years old by the time by when he was killed. I mean, we actually look it up and find out.
That's
but
really insane.
He was a young guy. That's for sure. So that's just one random. So think about that. 400. This is Braddock.
De Beaujeu.
And Braddock. There's four. The actual number 456 were killed. 422 wounded. The big thing about that was there was 86 officers, like the higher ups in that. Only, let's see, 26 were killed outright and 37 wounded. And because of that, which is more than half of your government at the time, these are the top people, almost all completely wiped out in one single battle, one event, all by this brave guy, along with help. But this guy whose name has been lost, there's no Bijou Street in Pittsburgh.
Oh my God, there's not?
No, there's a Grant Street, which we're going to talk about next.
Well, let me, so what you're telling me is Chevalier Leonard de Beaujeu is not really known by anyone around here? It's like you yourself have not seen anyone else bring this up?
Ever. And no, the only reason I knew about it is because I tracked down a copy of that Baptism of
This is
Fortune Kane.
insane to me.
And then there's a Wikipedia page about him, but it doesn't even talk about that aspect of his battle. It talks about like when he was a younger man or how he came into power.
And your knowledge of him saying that he stripped off his uniform and donned their war paint is because it was handwritten in this baptismal.
Yeah.
That is just like, it gives me chills to even think about it.
I mean, yeah. And to think that like this just occurred in our basically
Where's this at
backyard.
now?
Braddock,
No, I mean, like, where's the baptismal at now? Where's the book at?
I don't know how many actual copies exist. I own one that I don't know how many others there are. I know there's digital copies of it that have been, that you can find online.
Is there an original one?
There is, but the story behind all those is interesting. This guy named Charles Dollinger, I think was his name. He was like me, but like 100 something years ago. And he was rich though, as he wasn't like me. But he spent all of his fortune trying to track down these early Pittsburgh artifacts and early Pittsburgh like handwritten stuff and photographs and any kind of memorabilia to deal with Pittsburgh. And all of his collection was donated to University of Pittsburgh when he died in like the 1890s or whatever.
Oh wow!
But he was around in the 1800s and was able to get like firsthand detailed accounts of all this stuff.
Jeez.
And collected. And he had the original stuff like written in French from that. And so I don't know if I'm sure it exists. I just don't know if it's in at Pitt or if it's some other private library, but it does exist somewhere.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah. So, and that's another thing when you think about how these stories are remembered or collected, and it's because of people like myself or that were around 100 years ago.
Yeah.
A guy named, my favorite historian from back in that time period, is a guy named, he went by the nickname Phlegm.
Phlegm?
Yeah. And like he said it in a positive way. People like, hey, Flemmy, but his name was, Fleming was his last name. But he went by initials like GM Fleming or something like that. But this guy, he was the first person to graduate from a high school in Pittsburgh. So like the Pittsburgh High School, like the very first one ever that opened up when he was around, and he graduated. He was one of the first graduating classes, but then just became like this interesting, compiler of old Pittsburgh history.
Yeah.
One that all of us have benefited from, especially myself. So you're going to get to, so that's the interesting story behind it. It's kind of like weird heroes on both sides kind of story. But we're going to talk about the next big battle, which happened in Pittsburgh, which was just a few years later. So after that happened, the British were really defeated. I mean, this was like the biggest, worst possible thing in trying to get Pittsburgh in the name of England. It just wasn't going to happen. There was no way. It was too hostile for anybody other than the French to deal anything. So they really kind of just gave up. It wasn't until 3 years later they decided to try to come here back to Pittsburgh and see if they could do some kind of thing again. And this time it was a different general, General John Forbes, which Forbes Avenue is named after. And he's also the person who gave Pittsburgh its name. But he was in charge of an expedition, again, the Forbes expedition, from somewhere over the east part of Pennsylvania, and made Forbes Road, which you can still drive on to this day. And you can still see the markers of where that road existed. But the road eventually was supposed to just kind of pop out in Pittsburgh. Like that's where you wanted. The end goal was Pittsburgh. So he's halfway through this expedition, and he has a guy with him named James Grant. So when you think of Grant Street downtown, everything has a story behind how it got its name. People usually think it's, Ulysses S. Grant or some other Grant.
100%. I thought it was Ulysses S.
Yeah,
Grant.
no one thinks about this Colonel James Grant from Ballindock, Scotland, right? He was, in fact, the Laird of Ballindock is what his official title was.
Wow.
Big guy, 300-something pounds in this time period, which meant that you were rich, you know? He had a big ego, this guy. And there's so much, you could do a whole show just about him. But he had this idea that he could maybe succeed or kind of outdo General Forbes and become like a little hero in his own right if he kind of broke apart from the army and took like a couple hundred guys to Pittsburgh and ambushed the French who were here before the big army would come. So he thought this would be kind of a cool idea. So he gets about 300 people. And it's kind of a ragtag group. There is no official army at this point. The army didn't exist. It started in Pittsburgh, which we'll talk about our last connection story. But it didn't. So it was very informal. People from Scotland, people from Scottish Highlanders in particular. So you think Braveheart, kilts, the works, bagpipes, drums. Highlanders were fighting here in Pittsburgh for the British against the French. So James Grant decides to come here, and this was on the exact date is kind of iffy because it happened over a course of a couple of days, but let's just say September of 1758. He decides to come down to Pittsburgh in the middle of downtown Pittsburgh. That's Market Square right there. But right around this pond right here is where the courthouse is today. The same courthouse that was built in 1888, the one that's there today. It replaced the one that was there from the 1850s, which replaced an even earlier one from way back in the day.
That's wild. It's always been that area.
Right. And that area has always been called Grant's Hill, or Grant Street is right there at the bottom of it. But literally that spot where the courthouse stands was called Grant's Hill. And it was called that because at one point in Pittsburgh history, in the middle of downtown Pittsburgh, there was a hill the same height as Mount Washington. Now think about how tall Mount Washington is to the point, right? In the middle of downtown Pittsburgh, there was a mountain in the middle of downtown Pittsburgh they called it Grant's Hill. I don't know what they called it before. They actually did have different names beforehand, like Boyd's Hill, and there was other names of different hills around here.
That's wild to think about.
Not only that, but it took like 200 years of them cutting it down. And the last time they did it wasn't until like the 1920s, when they finally did the final section, which is when you go down to the courthouse, you'll see that the entrance that you go into is actually the basement and not the first floor. Because like it was literally the first floor was street level, and they dug out that entire basement level.
Wow.
Yeah. And just to think about just that, like the best example is looking at the Bridge of Sighs, that one that goes over top.
Yeah.
There's like a 10-foot difference in the road, 1910 to 1930. Just then.
That's interesting to think about.
Yeah. I don't know how many feet, over 100 feet. I know like 86 feet or something were dug out like in the 1850s. Who knows how much was even dug out prior to that.
Yeah, that's insane.
The story of this hill has a weird story to begin with. Like in early Pittsburgh history, not only did this big event happen there, but also Native Americans used to bury their dead there. So like all that's gone.
You think a lot of people know that Pittsburgh just has all these bodies just right there?
Well, no, that's exactly why I want to talk about this. Yeah. So in this exact event, James Grant comes here. He wants to try to ambush the French and anybody that's down at Fort Duquesne at the time. So they figure a good vantage point would be this hill in the middle of downtown Pittsburgh. So they go there. Now, he was still like one of these bold guys who wanted to fight in the line and didn't want to like improvise at all. So they literally, in the middle of the night, even though they were coming there in the middle of the night and going to ambush them, their idea of ambushing them was to start playing bagpipes and drums at like 4 a.m. from the top of this hill and just start like slowly marching down it, figuring that they could just kind of like, with 400, 300, 400 people can kind of just like be impressive and say like, whoa, look at all these people coming. We got to run. And that did not work. So as soon as he started, banging the drums, Native Americans from all sorts came out of the woods literally and surrounded them, massacring them all. 146 people die on the spot.
Holy shit.
Okay. 220 people were wounded, and James Grant, along with a couple other people, were captured and held prisoner at Fort Duquesne for years.
So these couple hundred that just got murdered, where's that at? Where did they get murdered at?
Middle of downtown Pittsburgh.
That is insane.
Yeah. Now, what makes it even weirder is that for years afterwards, they never buried the bodies. So both with Braddock and with downtown Pittsburgh, they just left the skeletons like to rot to open air.
Jeez.
And people would come there, and Braddock especially, something like 30 years later, would people would come there and it would still be filled with just pieces of bones and skeletons and weapons and bullets and things like that. You can still find bullets and pieces of stuff in Braddock if you go to the Braddock's field and metal detect. You can find stuff left over from that battle.
Holy shit.
Which is nuts. But the one in downtown Pittsburgh and this defeat, it was called the Battle of Fort Duquesne. Actually in Assassin's Creed 4, I think, one of the Assassin's Creed games on the PlayStation, and Xbox or whatever, takes place, and that battle's in the video game, which is kind of cool.
Really?
Yeah, you can play the Battle of Fort Duquesne, which is sweet. Yeah.
Wow.
Very
That's pretty
historical
wild.
game, which is neat. Yeah.
Is there a big ass hill in it?
Braddock's even in it. Yeah, he's one of the people you have to assassinate. Actually.
Damn.
Yeah. So it's cool. Anyways,
jeez.
yeah. So that's going on. Horrible defeat here in Pittsburgh, and kills 100 people and wounds over 200. And now there is a sign for that one at the courthouse on the side of the building saying this is the site where 100 people were murdered, on September 1st.
That's on the courthouse?
1758, yes.
Wow.
It is on the courthouse. And talk about Grant's Hill, because it's literally something that everyone's forgot. Like, nobody alive today was here when that hill was here. So, and then nobody alive, especially, was here when this stuff was going on.
I mean, I've never even heard about that. I mean, and that's not common knowledge then?
Well, that particular one is more common knowledge, maybe,
yeah, but still not.
Not, yeah. And that is there. I even had a little bit more details, but yeah, that is that gets pretty crazy. So that's just another example of how many people were murdered or could potentially haunt downtown Pittsburgh. Hundreds. Okay, so Braddock is the worst. Like, I don't know, Braddock would be like, if from a historical standpoint and how many people were murdered in like one spot in a very tragic
concentrated
way,
area,
that would be the spot.
Wow.
So who knows? If I haven't really looked into like Braddock ghost stories that might be tied to old soldiers walking around. Who knows?
That's the next Bucks trip.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Yeah.
So the last event we'll talk about is in downtown Pittsburgh was the Siege of Fort Pitt. All these great names, for battle.
These are wild.
And the Siege of Fort Pitt. So the French-Indian War by this time is over.
Yeah. What year is the Siege of Fort Pitt?
So that happens in 1763.
Okay.
August of 1760. Well, late June, July, and August of 1763.
So just a handful of years after these other ones.
Right. Now that we were safe from the French, because the French blew up Fort Duquesne, abandoned it, and they left. And so when the British got here, after James Grant was defeated, General John Forbes kept on coming to Pittsburgh and eventually was able to secure it by kind of scaring the French out of this area. And they abandoned it and they blew it up. And so when John Forbes came here, it was empty.
And he just took it over.
Took it over, called it Pittsburgh. 1763 is the year he did it.
Why was the name Pittsburgh?
He named it after William Pitt,
Okay.
who was I can't remember his exact position at the time, but he was like an MP in England. William Pitt the Elder, also the Earl of Chatham was his name. And then Borough, it was a common name for a town.
Yeah.
Or burg. If you're from Germany, it's kind of a burg.
Huh.
If you're from Scotland, it's a borough. Edinburgh. So when he called Pittsburgh, he called it Pittsburgh. And then it stayed like that, Pittsburgh, not Berg, for a long period of time, especially anyone with a Scottish influence. I mean, it was always Pittsburgh, And that gets into the origin of the H in our last name, because borough, like Edinburgh, has an H. Or, well, I don't know if that, no, I guess it doesn't. But the why it's spelled with an H, it all stems from that time period. Because like when he originally put it on a piece of paper, I'm calling this place Pittsburgh in your honor, he spells it with an H. So, but then like the next day, doesn't spell it with an H, literally, and the next day.
Snip, snap.
It goes back, and so it's on and off, on and off, on and off. So there is no real correct spelling of anything, really. It's just about anybody who agrees upon a spelling, and then it becomes the correct spelling. But in reality, there is no such thing as correct spelling in general. So anyways, just what we agree upon. And that brings up a whole nother interesting topic of like, the origin of all that stuff. So I'm going to tell you a little text exchange, let's say. It was a letter exchange between the commander of Fort Pitt at this time in 1763 to his general, and this event that occurred during that time period, which is when I mentioned earlier that there could be potentially 1 million people that were killed, is because of this event. So, and this is, I spent the time to actually look at it's not a great photo of it, but this is a photo of what it looked like that I was transcribing. And that is actual handwritten letters from this time period here in Pittsburgh. And now I have to back up by saying that some of the words are not exactly the greatest, but it's interesting to hear how they kind of talk to each other and what the results of this particular battle were. So to give you some perspective, French and Indian War is over. The British basically have secured Pittsburgh now, and you think everything would just be fine. Well, no, because there's still Native Americans living around here, and not only living here, but have been here for generations upon generations and aren't just going to leave. How do you tell somebody who's been here for 300 years, your family tree goes back to here, and then you just say, this is not yours anymore, you got to go, or you join up with us or whatever, no matter what whether you agree with us or not, you still got to be on our side, a confusing time. And there was plenty of different Native American chiefs who were on both sides, kind of played both sides. But one guy who did not play both sides was Chief Pontiac. Now, Pontiac is kind of an American name. All these Native Americans had different Native names, but we call them generally as Pontiac. And this event in 1763 called Pontiac's Revenge, and the siege of Fort Pitt, is a battle in Pontiac's Revenge.
Wow.
He was able to, from Fort Detroit at the time, all the way down to Western Pennsylvania and all the different places and locations kind of in between, was able to kind of get the word out to all Native Americans from all tribes, not just the Mohicans or the Onondagas or the Delaware. There was to literally all kind of tribes that were around this area that were done with the British. We were done with the French already, but now we're done with the British. And either you're with me or you're against me, and we're going to take it back. One final time, the one biggest push of Native Americans to stand up for themselves and fight back. And it almost worked. It almost succeeded. They caused such chaos and such general war that people in these early British people who were trying to survive had to resort to extreme measures in order to stop the Native Americans from attacking this area, which they now claim to be theirs. So this is actual letters between the commandant, Henry Bouquet, who, if you go down to Fort Pitt today, or Point State Park, you'll see there's that blockhouse that was called Bouquet's Blockhouse.
Oh.
He's the guy who built it.
Yeah.
That building was built this year. It's 1763. And it's the oldest known building in Pittsburgh. And it dates from this exact year. Surrounding Fort Pitt, there were small little outcampments and people starting to build houses and starting to try to settle and farm and make a living. Well, the Native Americans were having none of that, and so not just destroying everyone down the river, completely wiping out families, whole towns and communities. In super extreme violent ways. They weren't taking prisoners at this time period. They just wanted death, and just really try to prove a point. Now, of course, they had a point. Because imagine today if the French just invaded downtown Pittsburgh and say, "Oh, you are going to work for me,"
Good luck.
Yeah. So and that happened multiple times throughout Pittsburgh history, throughout all history. And so it's weird when you're talking about it. So all I can do is just tell you the facts. So Colonel Henry Bouquet is writing to his general. This is June 30th, 1763.
My birthday.
Oh, he says, there appears to be a few savages yet on these frontiers, but every tree has now become an Indian for the terrified inhabitants of Pittsburgh. So that was the mindset that he wrote to the general, that there were so many crazy things going on that literally like every stick and everything that you saw just thought of a Native American was out to get you type of thing. He writes, P.S. I will try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall into their hands, taking care, however, to not get any diseases of myself. As it is a pity to oppose good men against them, I wish we could make use of the Spaniards' method and just hunt them down with English dogs. Supported by rangers and some light horses, who would I think effectively extirpate or remove that vermin race? This is what Henry Bouquet writes to his general. Amherst, his general, writes back to him, P.S. You will do well to try to inoculate these Indians by means of the smallpox-infested blankets, as well as to try every other method that you can to serve to exasperate this execrable race. I should be very glad if your scheme for hunting them by dogs would take effect, but England is at too great a distance to think of that type of attack at the present. A few days later, Captain Simeon Ecuyer, who was a Swiss mercenary hired to be in charge of the military at Fort Pitt, writes that in a good state of defense against all attempts from the savages who are daily firing upon the fort, unluckily the smallpox has broken out inside of the fort, for which we have built a small hospital underneath the drawbridge to prevent the spreading of this disease. The next 2 days later, Henry Bouquet writes to his general again, to reinforcement you have ordered this way so considerable by the additional number of officers will fully enable me to crush the little opponent that they may dare to offer along the road, and to secure a part of the country against all future attempts. Till you think proper to order us to act in conjunction with the rest of your forces will be to kill this vermin from a country that they have forfeited, and all claims with it the rights to any kind of humanity.
Jeez.
He continues, I have no pretension to be the judge of any kind of Indian affairs, but I should be sorry we should ever appear to be under at least obligation to the perfidious Cherokees as to any of the other Native Americans, that we make them no more a nation. I would rather choose the liberty to kill any savage that may come our way than to perpetually doubt whether they are friends or foes. Next is this general replies to him. He goes, I shall only say this, that it behooves the whole race of Indians to beware, for I fear the best of them have in some measure to be privy to and concerned in the late mischief of carrying matters much further against any Englishman, or daring to form conspiracies, as the consequences will most certainly occasion measures to be taken that, in the end, you will put a most effectual stop to their very being of existence. Now, you noticed at one point that I said that they were going to inoculate the natives by means of smallpox-infected blankets.
Yeah, that's so crazy to think about.
Now, this apparently did happen, obviously. I mean, it was a conversation between the commandant and the general of the army.
They put smallpox in blankets.
People were already dying from smallpox.
Yeah.
And those blankets that they were, using or whatever, infested with that disease. The Native Americans, while doing things like sieges and complete like just all on attacks, also tried peaceful measures of doing things like seeing if there's any kind of deal we could strike or any kind of whatever. And so they did this multiple times during this whole siege period. This went on for over a month and a half of not being able to leave your front door because you were going to be killed one way or another, or pushed back into the fort. Anyone who was living outside of the fort had to come in to be protected by the walls of the fort, literally. And it was overcrowded. not a good place to be at that time period. You couldn't leave, couldn't go back out. Most of all your settlements that you did try were already burned to the ground. The English, in fact, went as far as to start burning down all the different encampments, so the Native Americans had nowhere to hide. Even so, it was like a serious big event, and they went as far as to try to like give them a peace offering of disease-covered blankets. That event, according to American history now, is considered the first use of biological warfare.
Jeez.
Yeah, and it stems from this event and these letters from the summer of 1763 in Pittsburgh.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that single event, while of course, killing the first people who came in contact with it, apparently spread so much that it essentially wiped out Native Americans as we know them today. From that one single event, some people claim that is the catalyst that was their downfall. Yeah. So it was. So that happened to downtown Pittsburgh.
That's insane to think about.
Yeah, and to think. So that's just one of that's one event of who knows how many events occurred. I mean, not just mention all the different skirmishes, but all these actual big battles. So hundreds of people, falling and dying here. Nobody knows their names. Nobody, we're the only people talking about them. It's this lost history of the stuff that's like you think that when you have a big event that it would be recorded down and you would be remembered, but you're not.
Yeah,
people weren't.
Yeah, you think like stuff like that would be talked about forever.
Yeah,
but
you would think
it's just not even brought up at all.
I did talk about those weird islands, so I don't want to keep you hanging. With this particular island, they called Smoky Island or Killbuck Island after Chief Killbuck, who was another one of the Native American chiefs around here. And most of the Native Americans did play both sides. So they were both like, Chief Killbuck, for example, fought against the British in the siege of Fort Pitt, but then later became their friends and they gave him an island.
Okay.
So
this island is 1795, does that say?
It was still there up until the 1820s.
Oh, okay.
It was basically the back channel was filled in by literal trash and
When
garbage.
did they give it to him? What year?
Sometime after the 1770s, like Revolutionary War time.
Okay, yeah.
Like Revolutionary War. And that's a whole other story about things that went on at Fort Pitt during the Revolutionary War. You don't think about that, what happened. The Revolutionary War was like a civil war, where you had your neighbors, just like today, supporting a certain cause. And it became like a very brother against brother type of fight. So it wasn't the British coming on boats. It was the British who lived next door. I mean, everybody was British. So it was just like, did you believe in these new 20-year-olds who were coming to writing around the Constitution? Because they were old in their 20s. It was
That's so crazy to think about that.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Is that real?
It is real.
They were in their 20s when that got...
One of them was like 19. I think James Madison was like 19 or something.
I don't know why I've never thought about that until this day. Like whenever you said Chevalier Leonard de Beaujeu was only like in his 30s, like it's so weird because like in my mentality, I still think of myself as like an adolescent, like a little kid learning about things.
Yeah.
Learning about these like adults. And whenever I say adults, it's in quotes because
twice as old as the people.
Yeah, like that's so crazy to think about that.
It is.
Wow.
Yeah. So that island, prior to Killbuck getting it or receiving it as a gift, it was the site of some of the craziest, most violent stuff that ever went on in downtown Pittsburgh.
We're sorry. You have reached a number that has been disconnected or is no longer in service. If you feel you have reached this recording in error, please check the number and try your call again.
Thanks for listening. See you next week for part 2.